Welcome everyone to New South Wales DPI Dairies webinar number 13, Farmer Attributes, Profit and Precision Farming. My name is Nicholas Lyons. I am a Development Officer Dairy within the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. I have a national role supporting technology adoption on Australian dairy farms. Today we have the great privilege of having a fantastic and invited speaker with us, providing a perspective into a topic that is of much interest to everyone, but not commonly approached with this angle. Dr. Niall O'Leary is a researcher for precision dairy at Teagasc, Moorepark in Ireland. Niall has done extensive work, including a full PhD, in areas related to understanding farmer attributes as drivers of profit on dairy farms. Lately, Niall has been working and researching with sensors, technology, and the impacts of monitoring animal welfare. Niall is currently in Australia and got in touch with us given the work we are doing around technologies in the dairy industry. We had a fantastic meeting a couple of weeks ago with Niall and saw us align behind the idea that successful adoption of technology is about much more than technology itself. It has a strong social element into it, and that by better understanding farmers, their drivers and barriers, we should be able to design and deliver extension programs that are much more effective. Therefore, I thought these findings and messages should be shared around. So I really appreciate Niall's time and willingness to share with us his insights into farmer attributes, profit, and precision farming. The presentation will focus on sharing the results of his work, researching how English dairy farmer attributes and personality drive profitability, along with how these influence successful adoption of precision livestock technology. So without further ado, Niall, the floor is yours. I will share presenter rights with you.
Thank you very much, Nico, for the opportunity to give this presentation. I'm quite honored to have this opportunity to share this work that I've been working on for a while now. I just want to remove this. Okay. Nico, does that look good from your perspective?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk about I'm going to mostly talk about farmer attributes. What I'm going to talk about there within that broad area of farmer attributes is the importance of biography, the importance of personality, attitudes and beliefs, management practices. Once we've looked at how all these different measures are associated with farm profitability, we'll talk about what are the likely implications for your farm or for your clients if you work with farmers. Then at the end, we'll link that into the growing area of technology on farms and how the attributes of farmers might have implications for the adoption of technology. Before we do that, just a bit of background. So Nico gave a bit of an overview of what I've been doing, but I grew up on a dairy farm in the southwest of Ireland, a farm relatively large for the area. And you know, a lot of experience working on the farm and interacting with my father and other employees during that period, and that gave me an interest and ideas as well about what led to successful farming and what might be the areas that there could be improvement achieved. I then had the opportunity in starting in 2011, working with a consultancy firm in England to start researching the topic, what distinguished successful from less successful farmers. And this turned into a PhD, and there was 2 studies done as part of that PhD, and 2 papers will be coming out soon, one in the Journal of Dairy Science and one of the International Journal of Agricultural Management. So just kind of to get us going, a bit of an overview. What do we mean by good management as kind of an intermediary between farmer attributes and farm profitability? You assume good management or bad management is in between there somewhere. And I was looking at the start, what is good management? And it was actually quite hard to find a satisfying answer. I found this particularly interesting quote, more about what bad management is. While everyone agrees that bad management is the prime cause of failure, no one agrees what bad management means, nor how it can be recognized, except that after a company has collapsed, then everyone can agree how badly managed it was. So this was kind of one of the key challenges we had to start. How do you assess good management? And in the end, we ended up using profitability as our measure, because even though not all farmers are prioritizing profitability, they need to be at least somewhat profitable to allow them to achieve their other objectives. You might, as we're going through this talk, think about your own ideas and your own views on what's important about a person. What about a person can predict if they will do a good job or not? And also, when might we use this information? If we have an idea of what's associated with profitability, and there's a pretty good evidence base, when might we use this? So will it be in training? Will it be in hiring? Will it be focusing on your own personal development, on particular areas which you can get stronger in, or weaker areas that you can improve on? So to kind of give a visual overview of what I'm going to talk about today, the majority of the talk will be focusing on the 4 areas here in the middle. So we'll be talking about biography, psychology, objectives and attitudes, and specific management practices. So within biography, we might have things such as education, experience. Within psychology, we might have intelligence or risk aversion or personality. Within objectives and attitudes, we might have what are the priorities of the farm and how do they perceive the world. And in management practices, we might have how they plan their business or if they do benchmarking or not. What I'm not going to talk about today is what's below the line here. So I'm going to talk about how the farmer attributes likely interact with farmer actions, and then how these actions are associated with farm performance. There's been quite a lot of research done on other factors which would be below the line, so the importance of resources, family labor, land quality, say within the farm, and then outside the farm are external factors, weather, markets, policy, etc. I'm not going to speak to that. That's been done a lot before, and I think there's not enough been done on the area above the line, and I'm going to continue and show that throughout the rest of the presentation. So within biography, what do we look at? We look at age, experience, education, and specific knowledge and skills. Now, generally, the effects here are relatively small. So if you look at a group of farmers who might be age 60 and you look at a group of farmers that might be age 40, you tend not to see a difference in profitability on average. Same goes with years of experience in managing. We do see an effect, however, if we look at a group of farmers that have an agricultural qualification and compare them to a group of farmers that do not. About a 7 to 15% difference depending on the study that you're looking at. Looking at specific knowledge and skills, if you're looking at one specific skill, so for example, being a good mechanic or ability to repair machinery, that doesn't seem to have a clear effect either. And I think that's because it's case specific by the farm and you can't generalize too much. So a clear trend does not emerge. So in looking at biography, it really is just, there's an evidence base to support the importance of an agricultural qualification. So that would be the take-home message from that. So that was quite a short topic. We're now going to move into psychology, and this will be the largest topic we're going to talk about, and we'll go on to that now as part 2 of 4 main areas that we're going to look at in this presentation. What do we mean by psychology? What's included? So a lot of the work, or a lot of the findings from this, is actually from occupational psychology from outside of agriculture, because there hasn't been a huge amount of work done within agriculture on this. So we'll look at things like intelligence, emotional social intelligence, personality, and other measures like that. We're only going to look at today, because we're limited by time, but the 2 in bold: intelligence and personality. So intelligence appears to be the biggest predictor of job performance in general across sectors. There's been only one study done in agriculture, and it didn't look in too much detail at it, but it found that lower IQ farmers, so these were Scottish farmers, a group, lower IQ group within that study, tended to achieve £20,000 lower gross margin. In general, outside of agriculture, 30% of the variation can be predicted by IQ or intelligence. So one of the questions that you were asked in the registration form is, what proportion of variation in performance can be predicted by the attributes of the farm manager or the manager? So we can already see that there's quite a significant amount that can be predicted by intelligence alone. What do we mean by intelligence? Can we go into a bit more detail than that? Well, intelligence is generally thought to consist of two main areas. The first would be fluid and nonverbal. So this is the ability to see a new or novel problem and solve or use inference in a way to get to a resolution. This is largely genetic or biological and tends to reduce with age after the age of 20. The other main theme within intelligence would be crystallized or verbal. This would be learned and stuff that can be improved over time, or acquired knowledge, or maybe book smart. This tends to grow throughout the lifetime or throughout a career and tends to peak around the age of 55. So that was intelligence. There wasn't too much that you can do about that. If you have your intelligence, you can perhaps learn new skills and knowledge, but it's a relatively fixed thing. The rest of the talk will be about topics which will have a lot more potential to make improvements on. So within personality, the dominant psychological theme, the system that guides a lot of psychology, is called the Big Five theory. And it has been found that people across the world in different cultures and countries tend to have these 5 attributes, and it seems to be consistently found. So these attributes would be openness, conscientious, extroversion, and agreeableness, or neuroticism. The opposite of a neuroticism would be emotional stability. So neuroticism would be emotional instability. Generally, what's found is that conscientious is associated with job performance. And here's a table from a meta-review of multiple studies in occupational psychology. And here we have cognitive ability and the 5 different measures of personality. And we can see there that about 40% of the variation in job performance could be predicted here. So we have cognitive ability being the biggest one. The next one then would be conscientiousness. So how much attention to detail, I suppose, do they have? This would be the second bottom line. And the column on the right is the important one. And then the last line we see as well, emotional intelligence, is also somewhat important. Emotional intelligence is the ability to understand your own emotions, to manage your own emotions, and understand other people's emotions as well, and to manage them. Emotional intelligence has been talked a lot about in pop psychology over the last 10-15 years, and in my own opinion, it's been overblown. It's not as important as people make it out to be. But if you're interested in that, there's quite a lot of material out there, and it is relevant in certain contexts. So this was one of the studies that I completed for my PhD. It was of 60 dairy farmers in England and Wales, and we asked these farmers to complete quite a long questionnaire where they had to answer many questions, and this generated measures of their personality or their abilities. We could predict 40% of the variation in the profitability, either by profit per cow or profit per litre. And the 3 measures that came up as being most important were detail conscious, so that links back to the conscientious finding that we find across other sectors, the ability to show leadership, and as well a measure of how relaxed the person was. The more relaxed the person was, they tended to be less profitable. The more ability to show leadership, they're more profitable. The more detail conscious, the more profitable they were. So going into a bit more detail with detail conscious, this is probably one of the strongest findings that I found in my PhD research. A high scorer tends to be someone who would be described as focusing on detail, likes being methodical, organized, and systematic. A low scorer is unlikely to become preoccupied with detail, is less organized, less systematic, and dislikes tasks involving detail. To kind of differentiate that from other related measures, this is more about doing things to a high standard than perhaps maybe doing everything on time. So it's professionalism, doing things to a high standard appears to be the defining aspect of that here. Interestingly, we could compare the scores of the farmers that participated in the study in England with that of the general population. And the farmers there tended to score quite a bit lower than the general population. Most farmers scored about a 2 or a 3 on a 10-point scale, and the average for the general working population would be about 5. So that raises 2 important points. First of all, there's a strong association with profitability, and second of all, there's significant room for improvement just to bring farmers maybe up to the average for the general working population. What might improved detailed consciousness look like? For examples, this might be, so coming from Ireland, of course, we'll talk about grassland management and getting the most grass utilized per hectare. And that's something that in Ireland we're trying to encourage amongst farmers, and it's something that we haven't fully succeeded in doing yet. We have perhaps lameness seems to be a major issue on many dairy farmers or dairy farms, with it often being underestimated by farmers. If you locomotion score a herd, then the results will be a lot higher than the farmer would have thought of before then. Being more detail conscious might also be being more proactive in general, for example, with finances, avoiding late penalty fees or looking for finance before money is required. It's also probably important to say that attention to detail and high standards is something that probably needs to be instilled in staff. So a farmer can do that themselves, but if they're not able to get that to be adopted by the staff, then the impact may be limited. So there's only so much time in a day, and farmers' time is limited, so that they need to be able to instill that in their staff so that as they grow bigger, which successful farms tend to do, that their staff can also maintain those high standards. That links in with the leadership measure. This was defined as inspiring and guiding individuals in a group, leading by example, and arousing enthusiasm for a shared vision. Leadership, I think, is also relevant for small businesses, maybe with only 1 or 2 employees, because you have to lead yourself, and you also have to create a vision for yourself and for the people that are working with you on the farm, be it people, advisors or banks or whoever. The relaxed measure was a surprising finding. So those that scored high in this would tend to find it easy to relax, rarely feel tense, generally calm and troubled. These farmers were tended to be less profitable, and so there seems to be a trade-off between work-life balance and profitability, which is logical, and mental health, obviously, in farming is a very pressing issue as well at the moment, but there does seem to be a trade-off here, and I don't know much more about the area of mental health and farming, so I won't speak too much more on it, but it is an interesting and relevant finding. So that the farmers that tend to feel tense, find it difficult to relax, find it hard to unwind after work, they do tend to make more money or more profit per litre per cow. So that's the psychology section of the part 2 of the 4 areas going to look at. What can we take home from that? Intelligence is probably the biggest driver. Detail consciousness or attention to detail, as maybe more commonly referred to, is important. Leadership competence, so being able to create a vision for yourself and for others, appears to be important there from the psychology aspect of it. So moving on from psychology, we'll move on now to objectives and attitudes. And in the registration form, this was the area identified by most people as being the most important. We have a couple of studies we can draw on here. There's a FINNISH study of dairy farmers, which was published in 2013. Here it was found that entrepreneurial orientation was the biggest predictor of farm profitability, and that was generated by getting farmers to agree or disagree with the following statements. The more they agreed with them, the more profitable they tended to be. So, for example, a farm should be managed like any other business, or my managerial skills are good. Those that agreed with those tended to be more profitable. Another finding in that study was the role of strategic thinking. So farmers that agreed with these statements tended to be more profitable. For example, I can describe my business plan easily with a few sentences. Those that tended to agree with these kind of questions tended to be more profitable also. This was a study I carried out myself with about 100 farmers in England, and there was 4 main questions that came out as being associated with profitability in this. The first one we can see is related to the previous study as well. Farmers that agreed with the statement, "My farm is completely orientated towards maximizing profit," unsurprisingly, were more profitable. What was surprising was the scale of the association. So it was quite a big predictor of variation in profitability. So perhaps more so than people would have thought. Interestingly, the second question here, farmers that were somewhat less emotionally stable or maybe generally frustrated, they tended to be less profitable. So that was whether they agreed with the statement, "I sometimes lose my cool, don't salvage the situation as well as possible when things go wrong." The last 2 questions now were both counterintuitive to expectations, the findings there. So what we have here is the third question, how much insight into farm management did you gain between the ages of 11 and 15? And respondents who said they gained a lot of insight into farm management during their adolescence tended to be a lot less profitable. So this was counter to expectations. And I have some theories on why this occurred, and it may be that they have stopped learning since that time. So at the age of 15, they knew it all by then and stopped learning. I'm not sure, but it does seem to be pointing towards an interesting finding at least. And then the last question related to that was agreement with the statement, "Staff entering the industry lack important skills and knowledge." If farmers agreed with that and therefore saw perhaps the value in training and skills, they tended to be more profitable. We can perhaps think of these 2 questions as being the opposite sides of the same coin. This reminded me of a topic that I'd been looking at outside of agriculture, which is called growth mindset. This is a theory proposed by Carol Dweck, and it relates to whether someone perceives how you perceive yourself and other people. Do you perceive yourself and other people as having the potential to develop and become better and strive to do better than you've done before? Or do you perceive people as being relatively static? So if somebody starts out as a bad employee, are they going to continue to be a bad employee, or might they improve with the right support and guidance? And this seems to be one of the surprising findings as well of this research, that this seems to be a big predictor of farm profitability as well. I think as well later on we'll talk about the importance of these farm attributes in technology and technology adoption. I think this is something that is particularly relevant there, and we'll come back to that later. How does growth mindset look in practice? It means valuing hard work, not intelligence. So you might think that growth mindset might be a good counter argument to the importance of intelligence that I outlined earlier on. It might mean investing in training and organized induction for new employees, and a willingness and ability to learn and adapt to new circumstances, such as adopting technology on farm, for example, such as going from conventional to robot milking, for example. So we had one on the registration form, we had a question about how important is decision makers' risk tolerance on profitability. I went back and looked through my thesis, and I did look at this specific question, and there wasn't really a clear answer on risk taking per se. So whether somebody takes a lot of risk or doesn't take a lot of risk isn't really associated with profitability. Within farming, at least, there are some findings outside of it, but not particularly strong. What does appear to be beneficial, though, is if farmers engage in risk management. So if they're going to take risk, then they should actively try to manage that risk, and that seems to be particularly beneficial. So that's area 3 of 4, attitudes and objectives. What can we take away from that? Focus on profit or entrepreneurial orientation is particularly important. Having this strategic thinking or perhaps ambition is important. And combined with that would be the growth mindset. How do they perceive themselves and others? And do they see people as having the potential to improve, or do they see people as being fixed in their abilities and capabilities? So area 4 of 4, the specific management practices. The planning is one of the areas that came up in this area, and I think this relates back to strategic thinking, and I just highlighted an area here. I have clear goals that guide the way of farming. I think this is one of the few specific actions which are probably indicative of profitability, having clear goals and an idea of how you're going to achieve them. Within specific management practices, there are many different areas that you could look at. And so I looked at these 9 areas here. To be in general, the effects found in this area were relatively small. So those in bold, there's some evidence to say that they're beneficial. So setting targets, providing training and advisory services related to what we've spoken about already, being generally proactive, managing risk, and so on. But the areas at the bottom, despite looking, I could not find a discernible benefit from doing these topics. So for example, if you compare a group of farmers that do benchmarking and a group of farmers that don't do benchmarking, there tends not to be a difference in profitability between them. And this may be because it's appropriate on certain farms at certain times. So if a farmer carries out benchmarking for 4 or 5 years, then he may be achieving diminishing returns from it. And if he stops doing benchmarking, having learned a lot from doing it 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and you now put him into the category of farmers that don't benchmark, it's hard to see that effect that you might expect. But like I said, we do find an effect, although small, with those areas highlighted in bold on the top here. Specifically relating to decision making, it doesn't appear to be particularly important how you do it. So if you have a very formal or informal way of doing it, it does seem to be beneficial to include other people in your decision making. And if you're making large investments, it does seem to be beneficial to do some formal financial analysis to calculate your likely return on investment. So this could be years it takes to get your money back or payback period, or it could be something slightly more complicated like net present value, which does seem to be the kind of gold standard in this area, net present value, as it gives a very complete picture of the investment and as well the opportunity cost of what you could have done with that money otherwise. Specifically relating to training, there's a few studies in this area, one of them of Australian farmers going back 17 years ago now by Kilpatrick. And that study found that that when Australian farmers implemented changes on their farm and attended non-day or non-field day training, their operating surplus was on average $83,000. Those that did not implement changes and did not attend non-field day training tended to achieve a much lower operating surplus, in that case $31,000. There was another study of the effectiveness on training in 42 dairies in Pennsylvania, and it found that farmers that provided training tended to have a greater return on equity, but it didn't seem to have an effect on other measures which you would expect it to have, such as return on assets, or in that study they looked at somatic cell count and rolling herd average, but these were not affected. I think for training it's important to assess that what's actually required. So doing an assessment of what's required and what will be beneficial on a farm. This seems to be particularly beneficial. So I'm not recommending doing training for training's sake, but I'm recommending doing an assessment of where you might get benefit. Generally, outside of agriculture, we find that those that provide more training tend to be more profitable, so these other businesses. And generally as well, technology delivered training, such as what we're doing here today, can be as effective as face-to-face learning, which is particularly relevant in agriculture, given the rural nature of the business. Related to training is engaging in advisory services or consultants or extension. The evidence base here is relatively small as well. So there's this one study of beef farmers in Virginia in the USA, and that found that it was important the amount of visits per year. So 1 or 2 visits a year did not predict a significant improvement in profitability for these beef farmers. But if there was regular engagement with consultants, there tended to be a discernible benefit associated with it. There's also an interesting study from Ireland relating to discussion groups. So discussion groups have become very popular in Ireland, coming from New Zealand originally, the concept, where a group of farmers in a local area meet regularly, generally once a month, and it's facilitated by an extension officer. Research looking at discussion groups in Ireland found that participants in these discussion groups tended to achieve 12% greater margin per hectare than farmers that did not. And in the back of that finding, the Irish government introduced an incentive to encourage the other farmers to go and participate in these discussion groups. Interestingly, those farmers that joined after the incentive was about €1,000 a year if they attended, I think it was more than 6 times in the year, was not as effective. They did not find such a benefit for those new participants. And I think that goes back to maybe a theme that you'll see emerging in my talk, that it's the motivations for doing actions and that's more important than the action themselves. So it was the people that were proactive and who had a growth mindset that realized that the discussion group would be beneficial for them and their business, and who were proactive and went and joined, that got benefit from it. Those that only did it after they thought, well, I'll get a check at the end of this, they perhaps did not have the right motivations or the right mindset and did not discernibly benefit as much from the discussion group experience. So take-home messages from specific management practices. Set challenging and attainable goals. It's linked into the strategic thinking concept that I introduced. Assess what training would be beneficial on your farm, and that links in with the growth mindset. If you have risk, actively manage it if you can. So if you have the opportunity to lock in some of your milk price, for example, this seems to be on average beneficial. And relating to detail consciousness, strive to increase standards and perhaps professionalism, ensuring that the quality and of how tasks are done on your farm can be improved. Seems to be important there from that detail conscious measure. I dwell on that because it was probably the strongest finding out of this research. So we've looked at all these different things. We've looked at biography, psychology, objectives and attitudes, management practices, how these farmer attributes are likely to influence farmer actions, and then how that is associated with farm performance. So what was new today? What do I think that you might have found useful today that you didn't know before joining this talk? So we asked you some questions during the registration. What percentage of farm business profitability can be predicted by assessing just the farmer and ignoring the farm characteristics? So that's above the line on this slide here. On average, respondents said about 51%, and generally I think that's about right. At the moment, I'd be fairly confident that I could do a survey of 100 farmers or 1,000 farmers, and based on just questions that measure these things, be able to predict with some reasonable confidence who is likely to be more profitable and less likely to be profitable. In the coming years, we may be able to get that up higher, up to 60 or 70%. But at the moment, that's about where we are with what we know. The next question was, which of the following characteristics is the most associated with farm business profitability? So there were 4 options here. Most people indicated that objectives and attitudes of the manager was the most important, and that's something that I would agree with. It seems to be a big driver of profitability. Some people also mentioned in specific management practices, such as benchmarking, has been the most important. This is something which I hope I've conveyed today is less likely to be true. Nobody reported that biography was important, which I would also agree with the exception of education or agricultural qualification. And nobody seemed to be aware of the importance of psychology, which I hope this talk has informed you about. So we've looked at those important areas, what's most important. Now to kind of link into the more overriding theme in these in these series of webinars. How does that link in with technology adoption? So there's a survey ongoing in Ireland at the moment to assess this question. So we're assessing the financial performance of farmers that adopt technology and those that don't, to look at the financial benefit. And we're also going to look at the farmer attributes and see if that has an effect on if technology adoption is successful or not. For now, though, we can speculate, or we expect that successful adoption of technology will be easier for those with higher intelligence, because technology often brings more complexity, particularly during the installation and transition phase, and also attention to detail. If you're spending a significant amount of money, that's going to generate a lot of reports and lots of data, and you're not the type of person who is going to sit down and read those reports and look at the data and act on them, then you're unlikely to get the most benefit from it. We can also surmise that successful adoption will be helped by an ability to lead change. So if you're having a significant change in your farm, it'll be a big change for yourself, for your staff, and for your family. And the farm manager's ability to lead that will be important. They'll also be helped by having a growth mindset, because it's a big change generally. And as well, it'll also be helpful if you have a focus on profit. If that's part of the reasons why you're doing the technology, then that will be associated perhaps with more profitability. For example, if you're investing in technology to reduce labor, do you know who you will be replacing, or who is going to be freed up by the installation of that technology? Are they just going to be doing less important tasks than they were before the technology was installed? The reason I say that about labor is that there's been one study done in this area with Dutch farmers, looking at data from 2008 to 2013, and they found mixed returns from investment in technology. And one of the areas they identified was that when farmers invested in technology, labor costs did not significantly go down. And as some of these farmers, on average, the effect was quite minimal. It's likely some farmers benefited and some farmers didn't. And so for that reason, perhaps some of those farmers should not have invested in technology, at least from a profit perspective. It may have made sense from their own work-life balance perspective, but from profit, on average, it did not seem to be a significant benefit. I hope that this data, which is now 5 to 10 years out of date, is not representative of where we are today, that the technology has improved, the prices have come down, and I hope to be able to answer that question with this study that's running in Ireland at the moment. So, take-home messages from the talk today. Importance of intelligence. There's little you can do about it, perhaps except when you're hiring. But there's a lot you can do with regards to the issues identified within personality. So how detail conscious you are as a manager, if your abilities to lead and create a vision, also growth mindset, the importance of objectives, if you have a profit focus and have a plan, and as well, an ag education does seem to be an indicator of a business which will do better financially, at least. Specific practices appear to be less important, or at least it's really hard to discern an effect if it is there. But therefore now I'd like to thank you all for listening to the presentation and hand it back to Nico for some questions.
Niall, thank you very, very much for that excellent and exciting presentation. While the audience has a thought, if you've got any questions, I've got a couple of ones kind of to spark the discussion that maybe you want to give us some of your insight. One is, how do you envisage this vision that you talk about detail around that discussion around technology and the amount of data that technology generates, and that being more a barrier than an opportunity?
Well, I don't. Let me see. That is a good question, Nico. It is something that I don't have a good answer to at the moment. The fact of the matter is that if you go from having a type of farm which has limited amount of technology to a farm that has a lot of technology, the skills required will be quite different. And based on my work here with regards to profitability, I can only imagine that attention to detail becomes more important with the more technology you have, because you've invested a significant amount of capital in technology that creates data, and that data only has value if it's acted upon, and that I think links back to detail consciousness. So that would be my response there. It's an area that I'm going to be looking at more in the future, and is, I think, in the area of technology adoption, an area that hasn't been looked at enough to date.
Yeah, definitely. And there's also like an interesting conversation to be had about the working relationship between farmers and their consultants and this level of detail required for farming.
Yeah, I would concur with that. I think there is a value in building a strong team in a farm. So having your vet and your advisor involved in decision making seems to be beneficial. Having a support network, be that within discussion groups or local farms, which tends to need to be facilitated by someone, these seems to be beneficial, and these will then inform and help farmers get the most value from technology as they learn from their advisors and consultants and from other farmers who are going through similar experiences.
Yeah, and there was exactly just now a question from an attendee here around that topic. Do you see discussion group and extension activities as a way to advance in that continuous learning process, especially around the changing environment around technology, animal welfare, environment, and consumer demands?
Yes, definitely. I think the case of Ireland is very interesting. We adopted this discussion group model, and it was very successful. But it was important. It was important why the farmers were joining. So the motivation of the farmer, if they had this view that they themselves could grow and improve, if they could see the value in attending, in of itself, that was important. When people joined because of a check at the end of the year, this seemed to undermine the value of it. And I think this goes back to the importance of personality and attitudes and beliefs as being the precursor to actions, and that precursor being more important than the actual action itself.
Excellent. There's another question, Niall, here is, can you clarify a bit the relaxed versus tense operator success?
Unfortunately, no. It's an area that I mentioned because the effect was quite large, but as I said, it obviously has links in with work-life balance and mental health, which is a pressing issue within agriculture. But the trend seems to be that if somebody was more wound up, more tense, maybe more likely to get up in the middle of the night to check a gate or check a cow who's calving, for example, those people tended to be more profitable, even though they may be less healthy from a mental health perspective. But again, that's not something that I know much about, so I don't want to say too much on that area. But it is definitely an area for future research.
Yeah, definitely. The whole thing of life-work balance is really important, especially I think for farmers and people living in regional communities. There's another question here, Niall, around when there aren't a lot of dairies in a region, how valuable are business groups that may be more broadly ag rather than dairy specific? Example, focus on technology. Can this still be just as valuable?
I don't know if it would be just as valuable. So in the example of the discussion groups in Ireland, they tend to be organized by sector. So you'll have beef discussion groups, you'll have dairy discussion groups, you'll have people dealing with the same climatic issues at the same time. So I don't think it will be as valuable. If it's your only option, I think it's definitely something that you should investigate. It's something that I would recommend people to try and give it a go. And if they find value in it, to stick with it. And if they do it for example, my father would have been an early adopter of discussion groups, a participant. And after 10, 15 years of it, he found that he had got as much value out of it as he could, and he moved on. So I would encourage people to try and it may be very beneficial, but perhaps not as beneficial as discussing things with people in a similar situation to yourself.
That's a valid point. There's another question, Niall, here around how are you assessing the benefit of technology other than profit? Is profitability the only indicator of successful adoption?
That is, it is not the only indicator, but from my research perspective, it would be the primary one that we're looking at. So my research is funded by the Irish government, and our primary motivation is economic growth and sustainability in general. When you move to things which are harder to measure, such as work-life balance or many of the several other things that motivate farmers to farm, that becomes a lot harder to measure and a lot harder to assess. And I think the importance is if a business needs to be profitable for it to continue, and so it's a precursor to nearly every other objective and other measure of success. And if technology adoption has the potential to have a significant negative effect on profitability, which I don't think it does, but maybe had a few years ago, then that's something that needs to be explored more. It's not all good things and success stories. There are issues, and these need to be spoken about openly.
Yeah. Now, there's another question here. Do you have a recommendation for farmers considering technology? The top 3 things to look or think about?
Again, I'll go from the Irish perspective, and I think it's probably relevant for many farmers here as well. The technology that helps you manage your pasture is very cheap and can lead to a big improvement. So in Ireland, we promote these plate meters, which measures the dry matter per hectare, and you can get that for maybe $2,000, probably at the higher end. And you can get these with Bluetooth enabled, so you walk your paddock. It measures the density of the grass at particular points using the GPS on your phone. And that helps you manage your pasture more effectively and get more of your feed from that. The second thing is technology which will help improve fertility would be the second area to look at. So if you have an issue with fertility, then technology may be a good way to address that. So if heat detection is an issue for you currently and you're considering investing in technology, then I think that would be generally a good thing to do. If you have very good heat detection already without technology, the case becomes a little less clear there. And beyond that, if a technology can perhaps help with lameness or mastitis and it's a particular issue, then that might be one way to look at it. But technology may just be one way of doing it, and maybe can complement other more traditional methods of addressing these issues.
Yeah, and is it like if somebody's looking at a particular technology in itself, like what are your recommendations there? Should they look at the team first? Should they look at how it fits the business model? Should they look at what's the starting point?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm working on also is assessing how accurate these technologies are. So I've recently done a study on an automated body condition scoring system, and I'm also at the moment looking at automated lameness detection systems. So for a lot of technologies out there, there may be an independent validation of the particular technology. So if you have a choice between, say, multiple technologies, and one of them has had a study which assessed how accurate that technology was, and one of them doesn't, you might want to give the one with the study a bit more credence. The other thing then is to think about how that technology will change your day-to-day routine. Like I said, are you the type of person who will sit in front of a computer for 30 minutes a day and read the status reports and then make out a plan on how to act on them? Or are you someone who might turn off the alerts on your phone because they're annoying you? And that's anecdotally something that does happen on farms. People spend money on these sensors, say pedometers or accelerometers in cows. They get lots of alerts, and they'll, for the first few weeks, they'll read them, and after a while they'll just get sick of it and turn it off. And that seems to be the worst case scenario. And that's something that I think farmers need to be asking themselves, and advisors of farmers need to be asking the farmer, how do they think they'll react and how it'll affect the day-to-day running of their farm.
Yeah, and I think that's something the Australian dairy industry and me and my role, we've been quite involved in assessing technologies in an independent way and providing some of that unbiased science-based information to industry. And the
Yeah.
other thing to comment around that is that technology, I've always said that it's a tool and it's an enabler, but it's not a silver bullet. So it has to fit the farm, the business, and the whole situation. Now, probably the last question here is, what are your thoughts around family farms versus bigger farms, and the whole thing around succession planning and family businesses, and the role that this can have in all this topic?
To be honest, I don't know much about this area. So I think one of the things that emerged in this study, so if we look at the issues of detail consciousness, for example, that another way of thinking of that might be professionalism. And on family farms, you may have staff and managers who have never worked for somebody who wasn't a family member. And so then that might be part of the reason why the farmers in England scored relatively low on detail consciousness. How that relates to family planning and succession, I'm not sure. I think one recommendation from that may be that prospective managers should take an opportunity to go and work on other farms for other farmers, or maybe even work outside of the industry briefly, to kind of see how other workplaces operate, and how that, and then they can perhaps bring that back into the business when they themselves succeed in managing the business. I don't particularly have any other comments to that, unfortunately, but it is, of course, a major issue. You did mention as well the small family versus large corporate type setup. We tried to account for size in this, so all these measures were adjusted for per litre, per cow, per hectare. And so there might be a trade-off between detail consciousness and scale. So if you're going bigger, you might decide to make 10% margin on 500 cows rather than 25% margin on 100 cows, and those kind of trade-offs there. But it is something that I wouldn't be able to say anything firm about, unfortunately, at this time.
No, but I think that's a good valid point, and the fact of working on and off farm and getting that other kind of perspective, I think it's at least interesting. There's one last question that come through just now, is how can service providers encourage farmers or farm staff to challenge their own personality or way of working to improve forward thinking, planning, and profit focus?
That's a very good question, and it's something I've been grappling with myself throughout my period researching this. At the moment, I think it's just starting the discussion. At the moment, this is not really on people's radar. They're not talking about the importance of personality and farmer attributes and objectives. They're not talking about growth mindset. And I think that's the first step. Starting to talk about it, to say, actually, no, this is an issue, supporting or asking for more research in this area, because there is, despite the significant amount of research that goes on in agriculture, a lot of it is focused on the aspects below the line, which I showed in that diagram earlier on, and not so much on this area here. And those will be the first steps, and we can then start exploring how can we now have an idea of what's associated with profitability, but we're less sure about how that can be used and implemented. And we're kind of at the frontier in that regard of how do we take this message and affect change, positive change on farms.
Excellent. Niall, well, I just want to thank you very much again for your time and for for your insights here today with us. I think it's been an eye-opener, and by the interest of the registrations and the questions, I think it is a topic that people are interested in. So once again, thank you very, very much for your time and for putting together this presentation. I hope you got also some insights of value from an Australian perspective, what we are thinking in this topic.
Thank you very much, Nico. It's been a great honor to talk today, and I hope it's been of value to the people joined here on the webinar.
I'm sure it has. So as with all our webinars, this webinar has been recorded and will become available on the New South Wales DPI Dairy website. We also have a New South Wales DPI Dairy Facebook page, which is followed by almost 1,200 people from all around the world, and a newsletter which is sent out regularly to almost 500 subscribers. So please feel free to follow or join these initiatives to stay updated on all the work that we do in the area of precision dairy farming. For more information, I encourage you to visit the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries website, where you will be able to access tools and resources about the dairy industry. There is a specific section on precision dairy farming, which covers a lot of these type of initiatives, so please feel free to have a look at them. Once again, thank you all very much for joining today, and hope to see you next time.